It's always hard to know when you're right about something. When you feel like a character is justified in their own actions when they can be categorized between good and bad and heroes and villains. And it's even harder to see most of them even switch roles if you regard their story-based settings, even if there are various scenarios that can showcase good-hearted characters go down the wrong path eventually, or the ones that are redeemed. Because make no mistake, despite what the title says, there has been numerous cases of villains eventually becoming heroes, with films of course being even well liked beyond their original title, like a Terminator 2 type of situation. But instead for this, when it comes to speaking about an animated case, it's extremely rare and doubtful if it could even work at all. This is something that also extends to the talk I made a few years ago about Disney's dumb idea to make their remake villains or newer villains misunderstood, sympathetic like they deserve to be relatable in some form when they are not even remotely worthy as justified by their actions, where it becomes an interesting thing to discuss the fact that they have attempted to turn villains into heroes on several occasions to mostly not so great success. Granted, this video will go through cases of characters that can work in some way, but also how it shouldn't be regarded that they turn into heroes because of what happens. It's just something that just doesn't work even if you attempt to think it does. That villains cannot be heroes because villains are villains and heroes are heroes. I mean, what you're going to see here again is mostly a live action character study of how they failed miserably at understanding their own stories, but also an animated one that shows how it could be attempted, yet not exactly what you think. Because in their basic essence, most of them are just one and done characters. They hardly if ever even come back in the sequel because most of them are dead or imprisoned, or if they do come back, they just become evil once again since they were defeated last time, and it becomes like a Batman and Joker scenario of doing the same song and dance routine until the end of time, or enough to the point that they're just so tired of evil that they just join in with the heroes if they had a prolonged conflict or series. I mean, yeah, that kind of disproves my theory right there, mentioning that because of some other cases, but I can live with that since nobody really cares beyond that. But just for the most part, in the main theatrical arena, there is no real scenario that says the bad guy can be good now, or the main focus this entire time. Nothing just works that way because the story wasn't really about them. Also, I'm not saying we shouldn't do something unique to make it their view rather than our heroes, where I do think it'd be great if Disney or other studios can do a story where we would expect the typical hero of a fairy tale or modern stories to actually be the villain of the film, where the villain is the main focus of the hero, but how I'm just saying that the characters we know them as cannot be any more than what we initially see. That we should not expect them to do a complete 180 when their design was specific to the stories of the characters of that fairy tale. But speaking about this concept that I'm referring to, where the hero is actually the villain or the villain is actually hero, is something we've already seen before that worked in how they made films like Wreck-It Ralph, which is the biggest example of a villain who is actually the hero of the film, but also how the hero of the game in the film is actually a fellow friend and not the villain, as it turns out to be the main character of one game who ruined the next. That's something that really worked well for the story because it was going through the facade of video games where all the characters have these secret lives of their own, and it was just a job to be treated that way, where he just wanted to be loved like everyone else, to be cared for instead of just simply ignored, being the brute game villain that you have to defeat once you reach the final level. That's something that really works on its own and doesn't really count because it was encoded in the very first scene of the movie where he was the hero, and wouldn't work otherwise if we knew him to actually be the villain in the story-based sense. Just like Turbo, he served his role and he was always the villain from the start in his own personality because that's what he wanted. And Ralph was a hero because he was a good-hearted character who just served a job and purpose to play the villain on screen when somebody loaded up a few coins. A greater example of something we talked about before too is of course mentioning John Silver, who I consider to be the good villain, or how you could say he's more of an anti-hero or anti-villain the more you think about it. But what I never referred to him as was actually being a hero of the film, even though he did help and save Jim Hawkins, because that's actually not who he was. Like, yeah, he does indeed help him throughout the film, helping out a hero where the real villain was in fact his biological father, leaving him and his mother, but how he still commits to his treasure hunting plot, performing a mutiny and threatening the main characters on occasion. Also how you know by the end, Jim lets him go scot-free from any of the consequences he tried to escape, which he should have faced for his crimes with what we knew happened with any criminal, which shows he still really isn't a hero at all, or that the movie even showed that he was, because we knew his own ways, even if he entices Jim to join, which he knows he can't because that's not the path he wants to take, but respects each other for who they are individually. That his actions aren't heroic because he still travels around searching for treasure or whatnot, but that doesn't mean he's not willing to help the hero for what he needs on his journey, because he sees some of him in, him. But just separating the distinction, because it could be easy for anyone to mistake it as such, where if you do, you completely forget how everyone else would feel about him, where they were just right there, and they know what he did, and they want him to face full justice of the law for such crimes he committed. Like letting him leave off like that is similar to the case of what happened in John Silver in the original, allowed him to remain who he was as a villain while leaving them off on a good note that provides his service role very well. Just to simply remind you before you bring up that case, that John Silver is still a villain, no matter the cost. Where those are two biggest cases of characters that can fall under heroic definitions to some extent, while still being appeared villains. Where actually technically thinking about it, you could also include Goob from Meet the Robinsons, because he was literally Lewis Robinson's roommate growing up to become the bowler hat guy, and was still a good guy from the start, but just handed an unlucky fate where he grew up thinking everyone hated him and wanted to ruin his life, so he tried to ruin Lewis's in return of what he saw, until he did see the error of his actions due to what Doris was doing taking over, and how Lewis actually changed that to help him out for the better from the start, where you still could count him as a good character, but not quite a hero because he wasn't that really, and it was still Lewis's job to fix that. The rest of them, however, have not proven anything that said otherwise that they should become heroes or even ever wanted to be. Were they going to switch roles to become a protagonist? Because that's never going to happen, even if they are supporting characters. I mean, the biggest case you could stretch to that definition is Yokai and what Callahan did before that because he missed his daughter. But I really don't think that counts at all because he did stupid things like stop Big Hero 6 and steal all of Hero's microbots for his own personal vengeance. He isn't supposed to be a villainous character because he suffers from grief and even helped our heroes in the beginning, but that just doesn't fall under what I'm trying to talk about and more of just a failure of what kind of villain they made. Lastly, I don't think you should count Tefiti or Tekka in this case because we're dealing with gods in that form, where when you remove an element of them, they become another force of nature that you have to deal and stop with the actual focus being more on Maui and Moana's relationship and how Tamatoa and the Kakamora are more the villains in search of that heart in that regard, where everything else so far is just people who love to be bad in some form because that's who they are. So the only content you have left now to think about when it comes to making the villain the actual hero is those live action films, and spin-offs that focus on the backgrounds of these foes, where the very first mistake they made with these films was exactly making them the main characters, like Maleficent and Cruella, the titles that are just based on the characters we know as the hook to get you to watch these films. The icons of classic villainy are now turned into anti-heroic or simply heroic backstories for reasons because people just love the characters. You just discover more about them as per usual, where they grew up and who they are, where you see the different side to them that wasn't there before. And that's where things start to get stupid because you think about this practice of making them the heroes before or during the events of the film, so you could understand that side that somehow existed in the past or tried to pass it off as a new film that is worthy of any praise, even while it's not. Of course, this video in particular is more about discussing if they become heroes after the original film if they survived, but it's also important to understand where they have done it in some way and how it's generally not a good idea. The problem with this is that it sets a wrong precedent that all villains have these tragic backstories from the first to the last that make them more good. Because all Maleficent was just consisting of this fairy protector of the Moors that just got attacked by this kingdom on the other side filled with selfish people like Stefan for their own gain, or Cruella just wanted to be the best fashion designer upstaging her real mother who did the bad things in her life, while Hook was actually the first lost boy and friend of Peter Pan before he felt betrayed, wanting to grow up because he missed his mom, or just finally how Scar was just a good cub and the actual Prince Taka who helped Mufasa before he took his girl and then had to betray him because of that. Of course, that's an oversimplification, but you really do get the point of what is happening in each individual case of a character, where there's something more that needs to be explained with a villain that opens up terrible questions that don't make sense to why that they're here, or makes us understand that they are the actual heroes and that the heroes are actually the villains, where the current stage of events just allows us to not accept who they are in this moment in time and why it informs them to what we know them as in the modern day age. And if you want to think to how terrible that is, imagine doing that for Hades, doing that for Jafar, or even Chernabog himself, the physical embodiment of the devil himself who doesn't have any lines in Fantasia in which the character exists to just do evil, where they all had misunderstood childhoods or sympathetic histories that showed that they were good all along. That just butchers every single point about them. It is persistent in making these things good when they aren't, and bad things are good because of it. I mean, there's no scenario in my mind that would would make any sense of a character like Radcliffe from Pocahontas being good because he was just so selfish who only cared about gold and putting down savages. That is even more stupid than his own existence as a boring ass villain, and I worry if they even had an idea for Frollo as a film and what they would do with him, even though he is still a very complex character. Where you see here, what I'm trying to say is in terms of evil or bad characters, is that they have no redeeming traits of their own, or maybe do but cannot actually be considered as such because they're just so dead set in their ways. And what I'm saying is we can't expect them to be heroes like a Terminator 2 type situation because that doesn't really work like that. You can't compare a robot who tries to kill versus another that looks the same programmed to save, because that's completely different from any living being who does bad things and are expected to give them up later on. And it has never happened thankfully enough for Disney, but if it did, the implications are just far worse knowing where each of the notable villains already did in their lives. Like there's no way you expect Jafar, who got trapped in the lamp, to come out as the good guy because he still wants power, still held back to grant wishes until he was free, just like any other for that matter, because their story is written to leech off of the hero, to suck their life for themselves like a vampire or something else, and they cannot be heroes because that contradicts why we root for a hero instead. Where the nonsense these films perpetuate is just the fanfiction style fantasy that somehow made it past executives as the most appropriate thing for films to do. It does nothing more than answer hypothetical questions that many people simply don't want answered or even hear about in any shape or form, because they already get what they got when they watched it the first go around. And just thinking that thought for a single solitary moment is something that should not be considered at all, where if you do, you completely butcher the difference between good and evil. But then again, that is also just my humble opinion that not everyone can agree on, where I'm sure there are characters you can find that fits more easily, and how it's simply just a concept that is up to interpretation if you think one is fit to be more than just a set of goals or definitions, one that potentially can transcend antagonists or protagonists into something else, but how such thoughts are just way too unique to even think about if the consequences exist. Where that's all I have on this topic for the 1000th time. I'm actually all done now.